Úplně pro nás udělali všechno. Já jsem přišla hned na své koupali, čistý prádlo nám dali, všechno čistý. Takový pokoj jsem tady měla. Žila jsem tady 5 neděl. 5 neděl s šéfilou paní Rychtářovou. Tak já myslím, že opravdu spolupráce, že jo, to je jedinečný, co je. Když spolu můžete pracovat a věnují se vám. Úplně všechno mi udělali, co jsem potřeboval.
Hello, Zdravstvuyte, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor for me to address this breakout session on social and health services at the National Conference 2013 in Moscow. I'm sorry that I can't be with you in person there. I decided to, with great regret, to cancel my trip to Moscow only last week for various complicated reasons. I'm disappointed that I will miss out on hearing from all the other speakers in this session and in the rest of the conference. So this video is very much second best for me to actually being there with you, but I hope it will allow me to make a useful contribution. And I wanted to start with that short clip from a service centre for rehabilitation that was filmed by some of my colleagues in Prague in 2009, because I think it's very important when we talk about care systems from a policy perspective that we also hear directly the voice of service users and their experiences of using social care services. So I hope you'll bear in mind during my speech here Hedvika's words and her experience of using social and health services in Prague. So I intend to provide some answers to the questions who provides services and who coordinates them for a small selection of European countries. Before I continue, I want to talk a bit about my organisation, the European Social Network. We're a network which brings together people who provide, coordinate and plan social services, public social services, and to some extent also health services throughout Europe. We have around 97 member organisations throughout the larger Europe, not just the European Union. And our role is to provide opportunities for learning, good practice exchange and research to our members and to other external stakeholders. Care and support for dependent older people is obviously one of the major issues for social and health services in Europe. So it's an issue that I have worked on a great deal at ESN in the last 7 or 8 years. I'm going to draw on one of ESN's recent pieces of work, a study on the care systems of 6 European countries, to try and give you an impression of how social services and care systems for older people work in Europe. There are, of course, many studies by international organisations and academics about the structures and principles behind care systems in Europe and all around the world, but I sometimes find them rather unsatisfactory because they don't go into enough depth and detail. So in our study, which was called Contracting for Quality, we tried to get into the detail of how the systems work, to identify who are the actors in the system and how do they relate to each other. And you'll see to what extent we achieved this in the next few slides. So I said I would try to answer the questions of the workshop: who provides and coordinates social and health services in Europe. I have to say my presentation has more of a focus on social care services rather than health, but obviously the relationship with health is incredibly important. However, care systems are complex, and if we're to understand them, as I think we want to in this session, in depth, and in detail, then we have to not just ask who provides services and who coordinates them, but also some additional critical questions. And those are, who regulates care services? Who plans care services? Who finances them? And who manages an older person's access to care? In our study, we set out to identify which organisations in a system play the following roles. Regulator, so the organisation which sets the rules for allowing service provision. Provider, who provides formal care, whether it's home care, day care or residential care. Who plans the social services, so who assesses the needs of a certain population in a given area and then tries to develop a plan for meeting the needs of that population. And who finances the services? And then finally, who is the case manager? Who decides on the older person's access to health and social care? And I think that if you, as policymakers and experts in Russia and the CIS states, wish to develop a care system in your country, then you really have to think very carefully about which organisations fulfil these roles. But you also have to think about how they all interact and what impact, finally, those relationships, those interactions in the system have on the quality of life of dependent older people in your countries. This diagram depicts the relationships in European care systems. You can see on the top of the slide that the roles of planner, regulator, financer and case manager are in most cases fulfilled by public authorities or by publicly regulated insurance actors, insurance bodies. Then on the bottom left of the slide, you can see that the providers of social care can be public or private from either the non-profit or the for-profit sectors. Now in this breakout session you're asking who coordinates services, and in our model here it depends whether you mean coordination from a systemic institutional point of view or from the point of view of the service user. So we could say that coordination belongs either with the planner organisation or with the organisation which is acting as a case manager for the older person in the system. However, you might also argue, and I won't object, that coordinator should in fact be a separate role, and it's one that we might have missed out in our study a few years ago. And finally, on the bottom right are the citizens, also known as older persons, service users. They're also tax and insurance payers, and last but not least, they're also voters. So having talked now at a very general level so far about care systems, I now want to show you our findings from the 6 European countries. And it's interesting looking back on this study that we completed 2 or 3 years ago, because I can see some patterns that maybe I didn't see at the time. I've put together on this slide the UK and Sweden because their system is largely based on the public sector being the main player in regulation, planning, financing and case management. In Sweden, the public sector is also the main service provider, although this is gradually changing. In the UK, meanwhile, the main providers of home, residential and daycare are private for-profit companies, though they are publicly regulated. So I've called this Model A for the sake of this presentation. It represents rather a simplification, but it's just for the sake of giving you an insight into European care models. In Model B, the insurance sector is the main player. I've grouped here Belgium and Germany. Essentially in these systems, workers and employers pay insurance contributions, and when an older person needs care, they have an assessment and are entitled to a certain level of care, and it is paid for from the insurance contributions of the workforce, of the working age population. The role of the public sector is secondary here. Municipalities in both countries, to some extent, are involved in planning and coordinating local services. They also act as case managers, at least to some extent, alongside the insurance bodies. I said I had simplified the countries and the models. In reality, Belgium probably belongs between category A and B because the public sector plays a large role in providing formal care, for example, running care homes. Planning is rather weak in Germany according to our findings. Here there is essentially an open market in which providers set up services according to demand and then claim reimbursement of their running costs from the insurance bodies and from the municipalities. And then in Model C we have emerging care models, Czech Republic and Spain. The only real similarity between those two countries is that they have, in the last 7 or 8 years, introduced legislation which provides for the payment of a care allowance to individuals with a certain level of care needs. In both instances, in our study, we could not very clearly identify who was the case manager, or rather the case management function belongs with the public sector, with municipalities and regions, but it is probably rather weak and limited to the administration of the benefits rather than to a proactive approach of managing an older person's care and ensuring that they get the right mix of health and social services. So the specific question of this breakout session, one of them concerns who provides services, and in our study we looked at these 6 countries, and this table shows an indication of which types of provider are most prevalent in which countries. Overall, the message is that there is a mixed economy of care provision between the public, private, non-profit and private for-profit sectors. So far I've talked about the formal care systems, but it's absolutely vital to point out that informal care, care by family members, mainly women, covers around 80% of care needs in Europe. And together with volunteering, family carers also contribute a huge amount to the economy and to society. So in whatever system is created, that has to be recognised and valued. I also talked in the previous few slides about the role of the institutional financer, but the reality is that the users of care services, the older people themselves, pay a significant contribution directly to the costs of care at the point of use, not just through their taxes and insurance contributions. It's also worth saying that there is a growing expectation among policymakers in Europe about the role of citizens. The expectation is that they will take greater responsibility for their own health and well-being, aiming to delay as long as possible the onset of care needs. So coming towards a conclusion, I want to come back to the diagram that I showed you at the beginning, where we look at the roles of the different roles in a care system and how the organisations playing those roles interact with each other, what their relationships are. And I think one of the key lessons from our study for policymakers in Russia and the CIS states would be that you have to ask not just who provides services and who coordinates them, though those are good questions. You also have to ask who plans the services, who regulates them, who finances them, and who manages an older person's access to care. And the diagram hints at the final question I think you have to ask yourselves, which is how do these different organisations interact in what are complex care systems? And can those relationships and interactions be shaped in such a way to produce a good quality of life for older people in need of care? I think I've come to the end of my short talk. If I had a bit more time, I would want to talk to you about what Europe is trying to do to address demographic change through its care systems. I'd want to talk about good practices in coordination of health and social care, about prevention and rehabilitation, about support to family carers, and about age-friendly environments. But if you want to invite an ESN speaker back to the National Conference on Ageing 2014, then I'm sure we can give you a presentation on those issues at that point. So thank you very much. I leave you with my contact details and those of a colleague who is a specialist in this topic. I thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you, and look forward to further opportunities for ESN to support the development of social and health services in Russia and CIS states. Thank you very much, and bye.